But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we pick back up in our two-part series of Leonardo da Vinci. We begin back in 1482 when Leonardo arrives in Milan to work for the Sforza family. This period marks a turning point in his life. Over the next 2 decades, Milan becomes the stage for some of his greatest achievements. Masterpieces like The Last Supper, groundbreaking anatomical studies, and visionary inventions that were centuries ahead of their time. Join us as we explore how Leonardo's time in Milan shaped him as an artist, engineer, and thinker, and solidified his place in history. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we're back with more Leonardo da Vinci today for a second part where we're looking at the second half of his life. And so last time we talked more about the world he kind of grew up into, the young Leonardo, more before the Leonardo that we know when we think back of Leonardo, the long beard, stoic kind of view of him, and then this just incredible genius. And we talked a little bit about how he got there, and we focused on a lot of things like how curious he was and how he was so observant about nature. And we got to a point where we're like, he was a little unsettled. He was having a good time in Florence, and then he kind of wasn't, and he was looking to do something new. And that's kind of where we ended off. And today I think it's going to be really fun because we're going to go through kind of the power half of his life, where he's just doing invention after invention, artistic thing after artistic thing. And this is really when you think of, Leonardo da Vinci, the genius, one of the smartest people that's ever existed. This is the part of his life that I think is most interesting, because just continuously, every time you read something new, you're like, oh, he did that. Okay. And then what did he do next? Oh, he doubled up on that. Or sometimes even tries some really cool things and they don't work out, but it was such an ingenious idea that it pushed science forward in ways that people weren't really even thinking about. So that's kind of what we're going to get into today, which is going to be a lot of fun, I think.
And I think you unintentionally there hit on a very important theme that kind of stuck out to me when doing research for the second half of his life and, part 2 of this series, which is, I think I often associate him with his artwork. I've heard of the Vitruvian Man. I've heard of his artistic and scientific sketches. But I think one of the defining features of this chapter of his life is that scientific inquiry that kind of grows in terms of where his interests lie as he gets older in life and is expanding his interests beyond just what, his artistry, which he's still doing a lot of. But it seems like there's a shift that happens here that's not so apparent in the first one. There's probably some tidbits that kind of lead to this analysis, but it seems like there is a pretty fundamental shift in this chapter where, scientific inquiry, scientific observation becomes much more of a, central focus for him.
Absolutely. And remember when we ended last episode, we talked about he was going to Milan as part of a delegation sent by Lorenzo de' Medici, and he creates this resume/letter for the Sforza family. And he basically says, here's all the things that I can do. And he talks about great military work that he can do, defensive fortifications, all these cool inventions that he wants to work on. And almost as a footnote, he goes, oh yeah, and I can paint. And this tells us everything we need to know about Leonardo. I think not that he was sick of painting, but he just had so many other things that he wanted to do. But Florence wasn't the right place for him to do that, just because it was a little bit more conservative in the type of work they wanted, their artists to do. Very religious, typical art, the Madonna and Child over and over and over again, and the same kind of things over and over and over again. He wants to build military weapons. He wants to do great architectural work. He wants to capture nature. He wants to be inquisitive. And I think that's what he's going to get when he gets to Milan. And so he arrives in Milan in 1482 as part of this group that Lorenzo sends, and he meets Ludovico Sforza, who is basically, he's the Duke. He's essentially the king of Milan and the whole duchy. And he's very different than Florence, where Florence has a republic, in air quotes, with certain families having, a lot of power and kind of de facto rulership. But here it's very much on paper. Ludovico Sforza is the leader and the Duke, and he brings Leonardo into his service. And this is where, like we kind of talked about before, there's not this crowded and competitive art scene like we see in Florence. This is a much more wide open place where they're looking for a lot of different new ideas. And if we look where Milan is located to in the north of Italy, you have France, you have the Swiss, you have the Venetians, and they're always kind of at each other's throats. And so Milan doesn't really have the ability to sit there and just be a little bit more artsy, maybe like Florence is. And they really have to start thinking about their own defense. And they are much more of a militaristic society. So there's definitely different things that he can do, but he's not going to be constrained by that just pure artistic approach. And that's kind of the world I think that he's been looking for this whole time.
I think it really provides an opportunity to I think what we'll end up seeing is him becoming this kind of cemented polymath across so many different disciplines, right? And I think you start seeing it with his time in Milan, because it seems like there's a focus almost from artistry in the typical sense that we often talk about with these massive frescoes and religious paintings. But there's also this side of engineering, you know, to be able to design and think through potential military devices. But then there's also this other element that we just touched on, you know, which is this kind of proof of scientific observation into the natural sciences, right? He's still experimenting with anatomy, botany, physics. He's trying to understand hydraulics, the movements of fluids. So it's a great kind of, you know, opportunity for him to kind of bring all three of these interests together.
Yeah, and I think it all started right for him was he wanted to understand the natural world. He wanted to understand human emotion and, you know, how humans are physically built, because for him it was a way to create better art. But I think we start to see a shift with Leonardo where he's like, yeah, that's great. I want to know how to do this, and so I can, you know, do better paintings. But also I just kind of want to know. I want to learn. I have this ridiculous amount of curiosity that never ends. And I was flipping through some of Walter Isaacson's work on Leonardo da Vinci, and one of the notes he has is Leonardo writes in one of his notebooks, I wonder what the tongue of a woodpecker looks like. And so it's like, you know, not something I think anybody maybe has ever asked other than maybe someone who studies woodpeckers for a living. But that's just the kind of questions that he's starting to ask is, what does a woodpecker's tongue look like? What is all of these things in nature? How do they work? Why do they come together in the way that they do? And I think it's interesting because when we look at his first big project in Milan, this isn't some painting. This isn't some sketch. This isn't, you know, a small commission or portrait. This is something directly for the Duke, and it's a big one. It's called the Gran Cavallo. So basically the big horse. And it's essentially a bronze sculpture that would be the largest of its kind. And so Leonardo, and you know, he's not just building, he wants to really push the limits. So what he does is he creates this clay model of the horse, which is just in impeccable detail, right? Because he's probably studying horses more than anybody probably ever has, looking at how they're built, creates this incredible clay model. And what his plan was, he was going to hang it upside down using these pulleys that he created himself, obviously, his own design. And he was going to pour bronze into the clay molds, wait for it to harden, and then essentially take the clay model out. And then you would have this huge bronze statue of a horse. And, you know, nothing like it had ever existed at the time. And, you know, it's just to think like, all right, first off, the ambition of it, but he's got his own design mixed into this. He's building this mold in incredible detail, but this isn't the kind of work he's going to get in Florence, right? This is the kind of stuff that the Duke's saying, go do this, because I think it's a wedding or something that he has coming up, or to his honor, I think it's his father. And so there's a lot of just crazy stuff that's happening, but talk about an ambitious project.
I think the sheer scale of it too, right, is very impressive. I think the dimensions of the horse are meant to be like 24 feet tall, it's massive. And you're talking about the tonnage of bronze. I think this is probably very interesting. So he had this groundbreaking idea on how to cast the entire statue in one piece. Okay, I think that's a very important thing to note here. And his idea was that they'd require a massive furnace and intricate systems to control the kind of flow of cooling of 75 tons of molten bronze. So this was a pretty innovative approach, but you know, the project sadly was never completed due to an actual bronze shortage. So it seems it could have been pretty wasteful during a shortage to create this massive horse monument, which ended up being actually diverted to Milan's defense because there was a French invasion that they were trying to fight at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of sad how that all ends up because, and again, for Leonardo, right, he's known for not finishing projects based on the fact that he gets bored, but this seemed like something he was ready to see through to the end. And it's one of those few projects that he did, but unfortunately it wasn't his own choosing. War breaks out. And like we said, Milan's a militaristic city state and they're dealing with enemies all around. And these are just the things that happens. So unfortunately he has to abandon this project because of the war, but he continues to do, what Leonardo does. He starts working on urban planning assignments, doing military engineering. He's helping design fortifications, canals, weapons. And so he even had some contributions to one of the lock systems where they were using gates and counterweights to regulate water levels. It's not, a lot of his ideas weren't actually implemented, but you can just start to see like he understands hydrodynamics. He understands engineering. He understands military warfare. He understands civil engineering from a defense standpoint. And he's starting to think a little bit around all of these different things. And he starts to write in his journals, and we start to see designs for catapults, giant crossbows, armored vehicles. And a lot of people credit him with the first sketch of a tank, this kind of mobile unit, fire cannonballs while it's moving. And, a lot of these things obviously never were built, but you can just start to see his ingenious way of thinking about, what could happen, if you had the right materials and if you had, the right type of people together. And I think the most interesting thing with him is how you see his drawings from an engineering perspective. So when we think back then, people would sketch something out and just kind of go build it, where Leonardo has these really detailed sketches where he's one of the first to do what we call an exploded view. So if you think of a mechanical system, you kind of would blow it out to say, hey, here's how all the individual components would come together into one piece. He's already starting to do some of those drawings. So you'll start to see, here's a gear that's going to go here, and here's a pulley that's going to do this, and here's something else that's going to do these sort of things. And that's quite revolutionary for his time. And I think this is what's most interesting about him is he has this engineering mindset, and engineering not really being a formal practice at the time, mixed with his artistic ability, being able to say, hey, as an engineer, how do I want to envision things? And, oh yeah, I've got the artistic ability to actually go and do something like that.
Yeah, I think some of the things he ended up designing, I found this website that kind of talked through them. It's called openculture.com for our listeners who are interested. Because I think just talking about the diagrams and sketches does not do it justice. I would urge our listeners to go just take a quick peek. Some of the ones that really stood out to me, Paul, that you just touched on was like the armored, vehicle or tank, as we would commonly say it today. So the description of it, like based on the picture that I'm seeing, it's kind of this like turtle shaped armored vehicle. It's equipped with an array of light cannons arranged in a 360-degree layout, and it's intended to be operated by a crew inside that are turning cranks to move the vehicle, which is it's a pretty incredible, not just like leaps in understanding, but of like mechanical mastery in terms of how he's able to think through how this could actually be brought into application. Most of his ideas and sketches didn't come to actual fruition, but you can see that there is like a real desire for the potential application and actual design and build of these things.
It's so fascinating because mechanical engineering at its core is just transferring energy from one form to another, but you got to move it somehow, whether it's through gears or through bands or whatever it might be. And he's got, people using cranks, people actually being that engine to get this thing moving. Like there's no, internal combustion engines or electricity or anything back then. So everything's got to be human powered. And he's able to kind of understand that, if I have somebody here and I got to get energy and movement to here, here's all the different ways that this needs to come together. And this is how it would work. And if you look at a lot of his stuff, it probably wouldn't have worked. Some of it just mainly be due to not having the right material or not having enough, force from a human's perspective. But some of the things that he does too this is where we start to see his cool flying machines. So there's the famous one where kind of looks like a glider, where you would, a person would kind of hold on and would have big bat-like wings. You have one where it kind of bobs up and down and tries to create lift. And if you do the engineers have done the calculations on it, and they figured out that based on the materials that existed at the time, these things never would have flown. And a lot of historians suspect that Leonardo knew that. But what's interesting is you can tell he's been observing birds a lot and trying to understand lift and flight and how it works and how it's all about moving air underneath a wing, for example, at a really fast speed. And, that's just like, again, being able to see all of that and bring it together and actually put it into a practical sense. And it's not just, a bird flaps its wings and it moves. It's no, how does the air move through it? How is the shape of the wing different? And this is where you can see Leonardo starts to push things a little bit more. And again, just what makes him, so brilliant. I think at this point, like, we're just like almost in awe of, like, we're only 15 minutes in, and it's just, oh yeah, he did this, he did this, he did this. He kind of revolutionized engineering, tried to build some horse, and oh yeah, that's only within a 5 to 7 year period at this point. So this is going to just be the theme of the episode with Leonardo, because it just doesn't stop with the things that he's able to accomplish.
Yeah, you kind of beat me to it, because I was probably going to just keep piling on with his list of accomplishments, which I'm sure we'll get to. But yeah, so the flying machine, or the ornithopter, it's a mock-up, and I was digging deep into this one because I thought it was super interesting. Obviously, human flight is one of the greatest things that we've ever accomplished as a species. And there's been a lot of like actual mock-ups that have been made by different like flight and aviation museums across the world in terms of what this could actually look like in real life if it was built. But apparently he had over 200 drawings and sketchings that illustrated his theories on flight. So I think just to kind of think about what that means, not only is he designing like potential military applications, he's spending hours, days, weeks, drawing hundreds of sketches just on flight whenever he has the time. I wonder if this guy slept. Like, how can someone accomplish so much or have so much fascination, curiosity while being able to manage all of these things? And I think to continue to pile on, this is when you also see an element of like his artistic mastery as well, because he paints some of his really well-known paintings, or at least starts with The Last Supper. And then there is another great painting that I saw, which is it's the Virgin of the Rocks. So he's able to do all of these things simultaneously while he's in Milan.
Yeah, and he's actually finishing some of them, which I think is great for him, because you're right. Like, how does he have time to do a lot of these things? And the answer back in Florence, at least, was he didn't. He was supposed to be doing other things, and he was off thinking about, the tongue of a woodpecker, instead of, building or painting an altar. But I want to stop on The Last Supper for a few minutes, because I think this one for me is, probably Leonardo at his peak when it comes to his artistic ability. And so I've been fortunate enough to see it in person, and it is a massive painting. It is essentially covers the entire wall of a chapel. And so this was commissioned in 1495 for the Covenant of Santa Maria del Grazie. Basically what it is the story is that before Jesus was crucified, he had a supper or a dinner with all of his apostles. And he basically says, I know one of you will betray me. And so Leonardo, he doesn't just paint this people eating and him, Jesus speaking something. And there's previous attempts at this had kind of been more muted and just, here's a bunch of guys at a table. And why this one is so brilliant is if you look at every individual person within that table, they all have a unique reaction to Jesus. It's like almost like if you took a photo at the time that Jesus says, one of you will betray me. Like, what would people do in that situation? What if you're following this person who you think is the Son of God, and he says, one of you will betray me, and you're thinking, could this person be me? Could it be the person beside me? And so you see this mix of shock, anger, disbelief, guilt, and then the interplay amongst them. So, Jesus is at the center, very serene, composed, very spiritual heart of just, he's Jesus at the end of the day. But then Judas, the one who ends up betraying Jesus, is at the very end. He has a bag of silver. He's kind of leading away from Jesus, subtly kind of isolating himself quietly, while the rest are kind of freaking out. So Peter is in this really aggravated position. He's actually holding a knife and pointing it at one of the other apostles, saying, is it you who did it? Because it's not me. And then the apostle Thomas raises his finger, basically foreshadowing he had some doubts later about Jesus rising from the dead. And so he's able to capture all these emotions, but then bring it all together into this. Just again, the emotion can come through, right? It's not just a painting. It's almost like trying to capture a moment, as we would today with a photograph. And I think that's how Leonardo thinks, right? Is he's not just painting something artistically, he's really just trying to use it to capture that moment.
I think you did an excellent job analyzing it. I think in terms of just adding any additional context from my perspective, I think just looking at it, and I have it up on my screen right now, and I was looking at it, prior to us recording this episode. And I think just the realism of it and the reflection of all of the different individual feeling, psychology, the complexity. And I think, you start off by saying this is a massive massive piece of work. I think it measures somewhere in the realm of 15 feet by 29 feet. And to be able to capture that level of detail in something, that large at scale is so incredible. But to do it in a way where it does kind of have this like photo surrealistic view to it, because it's like a snapshot in time.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's a snapshot. It's really a photograph in, a sense of, Leonardo's interpretation of what would have been happening at this time. And something that's a little just funny about this painting and this, or more fresco, whatever you want to call it, is we're actually very lucky that it even exists today. So Leonardo was always experimenting with new techniques, and he did this new kind of technique with some oil on dry plaster, and it actually proved to be very fragile, and the painting actually started to deteriorate within years of its composition. Thankfully, due to years of restoration, it's actually still in good shape, and when you go to see it, they have it, it's only a few people allowed in at a time, and they have like moisture control, and they're very sensitive that this painting is, not built to last. It survived a bombing in World War II where it just almost got destroyed, but thankfully didn't. And if you actually look at the picture today, you'll see underneath what looks like a door. And at some point, the monks decided, hey, we want a door at the end of this chapel. And they actually cut part of the painting out to fit a door in, which has now been plastered up over the years. But it's very funny if you look at just, the feet of where Jesus is, you just kind of see the outline of a door just kind of coming up onto the table. So I think it's interesting how history, something like this stays around, and, just how many things have to go right for us to be even able to speak about the brilliance of this painting, that it even exists today.
And this wasn't the only painting that he was really famous at this time too. Like, I think the Virgin of the Rocks really struck me when I was looking at it. I think this was commissioned in 1483, but it's a depiction of the Virgin Mary, Christ as a child, John the Baptist in this like angelic rocky grotto. He's using this, very innovative stylistic approach of like light and dark contrast. And this just like the way he's created the figures, like the babies and Mary, it is so real in terms of how he's able to capture their complexions, their faces, their bodily movements. It is quite incredible. And it's not just, and again, I think it goes back to our previous point, he wasn't just working on this in isolation either, right? And I think that's the part that always kind of blows my mind about how productive this period is for him.
Yeah, I really like that one too, because just looking at it now, like you see the mothers in this, kind of looking after their children, but the children just kind of looking around, being kids and trying to, explore things a little bit. And I think you can probably see a little, Leonardo thinking of himself and, in this situation as a kid, and, how he's, curious about life. But you're right, like so much is going on at this point. And I think in Milan, he's really at home. I think he definitely doesn't have the same anxiety that he had in Florence. And I think he's a little bit more comfortable, and he's working on all these great things, but he's also having some fun. And I think this is probably the part that goes overlooked about his time in Milan. And that's his court pageantry and his theater. And so there was always people coming into the court of the Sforzas, and Leonardo was kind of like the chief theater guy, for lack of a better term. And so, he's designing sets. He's creating these mechanical devices. He's creating costumes that, would showcase the cultural sophistication of Milan, which makes the Sforzas very happy, but also lets Leonardo have his kind of inventive spirit going. And so one of these examples is he creates this, I guess like a mechanical lion that comes onto the stage, and it opens its chest and it reveals lilies. And it's kind of supposed to show this interplay between the alliance between Milan and Florence. But he's having fun doing all of this, and he's creating these shows, and he's making the Sforzas very happy about this. And it's a little bit more just, hey, maybe it's not sitting and thinking about things for long periods of time, but he's kind of having his artistic side come out in something that's, not just art, but a kind of the theater and the pageantry piece of it, which I think is just nice to see him. He's got still his creative side, and he's having a little bit of fun with it, which I think is great for him.
I think that's one of like the most distinguishing elements of his personality that kind of sticks out to me, which is, we've talked about his insatiable sense of curiosity, his nose constantly in his sketchbooks, just thinking through things with such level of depth. But there's also this, creativity element in terms of, how do you come up with these wild, ambitious ideas that, I think to your point, Paul, like in terms of the sense of pageantry, I don't think he's always focused or interested in like, utility of what he could be interested in. Right. And I think there's some contention here. I think in Milan, it's I think it kind of works in his benefit. I think we'll see a little bit later, in the next chapter of his life is that, where's the utility in some of these things? And I think Milan kind of gives him the opportunity to not really concern himself with some of that when it comes to the pageantry. And he can just create things for the sake of being creative without having any, direct military or like civil application.
Yeah. Because there's someone like him, it always seems this balance of, I got to do things with utility because, I got to eat. I got to make money, but I also just want to mess around and look at some different stuff. And I think you're right. The pageantry and the theater side of things too there's definitely a mix there. I think it's a nice mix for him of something that the court is going to be appreciative of and probably pay him well for. And it's also something where he can experiment a little bit. And, it's as we go through this, we keep talking about, his sketches and his designs and all of these things. And, really early on in the first episode, we talked about that, Leonardo is not this bury his head in books and just write and be very isolated. He's actually a very funny guy. He likes to have people around. He likes to joke around, mess around, and he has this kind of larger than life personality. And absolutely, he's going to spend time in his books and in his notes and really spend time for himself. But everyone who's met him basically always writes how funny he is and how charming he is. And I think it's important to see that, when Leonardo's in this setting, that's the part of his life that probably really comes out and shines. And I think it's important because I keep getting caught in the super genius, stuck in his notes, writing things, investing time in things, but not really looking at, maybe the more goofier side and the lighter side of Leonardo that, we don't get a lot of because he didn't write down, hey, today I went to a party and I talked to these people and I had a good time. He's talking about his inventions and his ideas. And everything we get around him on the social side of things all comes from secondhand accounts, which we don't have as much of compared to, his notebooks.
Yeah, I think it's very atypical for us, at least in the context of, the individuals that we've looked at. When you talk about, this degree of intellect, productivity, and genius, you often find someone who is not very personable or sociable. In Leonardo's perspective, it seems like he is actually pretty well-rounded in all of these kind of facets of life.
Absolutely. And again, he's having a good time in Milan. I think he's finally found his place where he can do a bunch of different things and he feels like he's at home. I think if you were to ask Leonardo, where's your home? He probably would have said Milan. But as we mentioned, this is Milan. They're a very warlike city-state. They have a lot of enemies around them, and things go really bad in 1499 when Ludovico Sforza is overthrown by invading French forces. And so as a result, Leonardo is forced to flee Milan, and this really marks the beginning of a period of kind of wandering for Leonardo. He needs to find a new backer, someone who's going to pay for him to do the things that he wants. And at this time, too, we talked about his assistant Salai. He's actually traveled to him with Milan, and now he's traveling with him again. So he's essentially by Leonardo's side this whole time. And we talked about it last time where, he was an assistant. He's a bit of a troublemaker early on, but there's definitely some sort of romantic relationship between Leonardo and this and Salai. So it's important to remember, he's not alone in all of this. He has people who are really close to him that are very special to him. And he's continuing to kind of move around and figure some things out, with people that he cares about. So he's moving around. He gets to Venice for a few months. And, as Leonardo does, he's there for a few months. He just designed some fortifications to help protect the city from Turkish invasion because, why not? And then he returns to Florence the next year because, you're only there for a few months. You might as well design some fortifications. So he returns to Florence, but this time it's different. Leonardo's maybe not quite a superstar, but he's very well known. The Last Supper, particularly for how great of a work it is, people know who he is. That, that puts his name in the kind of elite artist category in Italy at this time. But he's come back to Florence, and it's a very different type of Florence. So we talked about it last time where Florence was this bustling city of artistic design, very open to culture, new things were happening. But as we see in history all the time, when things move in one direction, there's a group of people who want to bring it back. And while Leonardo's gone, there's a Dominican friar named Geronimo Savonarola who comes in and basically turns Florence into this like theocratic regime, all about repenting and going back to your core Christian beliefs and really going after the Medici for their kind of stepping away from God and all of these sort of things. And, Florence goes into kind of a dark period at this point, and kind of people see it as kind of resetting things a little bit. And eventually Savonarola is executed in 1498, so 2 years before Leonardo comes back, and then things kind of go back to being that more center of artistic innovation. So, he's missed out on a kind of a dark time for Florence, but he's coming back to a time when artists are starting to thrive again. And, he's got name recognition this time. People want to work with him. He's not Leonardo before who doesn't finish his projects. People know he can finish projects now. And it's going to be interesting for him to see how he can kind of fit into this, because like we mentioned before, Florence is more traditional in the type of work that they're going to give him. It's not like Milan. And so we'll see how long he's going to be able to last in Florence, because it's not going to be the same again as what he got in Milan, but maybe a little, not going to be as maybe bad as, the first time.
Yeah, I think looking at this period of his life, I think his return to Florence, when I think he gets lucky, the timing kind of works in his favor, that's for sure. But I think it also marks a very dynamic phase in terms of his, his creativity and his intellectual growth. But there's also, some interesting contentions at this period that I'm sure we're going to get into in terms of like professional rivalries and personal challenges. We're going to talk about Michelangelo, Raphael. I'll quote, or I'll take something from Walter Isaacson just as like kind of a precursor to this, but it seems like the period between 1500 1506, where he's back in Florence, it's kind of this critical phase of his life where his creative genius, his insatiable curiosity kind of converges to produce some of his most iconic work, which we'll get into, like the Mona Lisa. And it's also a time, Paul, to your point, where he's kind of reintegrated back into Florence's very vibrant artistic community. And, this is where his engagement with those commissions kind of start to blossom.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really kind of a crazy 6 years. And I think a lot of this stuff kind of peaks in terms of his investigation into like the human body, for example. And none of this happens all in Florence. It's happening in Milan, but we really start to see him kind of hit his stride a little bit when he's in Florence. But before we kind of get into maybe the artistic side, I want to talk about his time with Cesare Borgia for a little bit. So Cesare Borgia he was the son of the Pope, and he was basically trying to carve out a piece of Italy for himself in the Emilia-Romagna region. And so he's basically a warlord at this point. He's got the backing of the papacy. He's trying to take over a lot of these areas. And he actually brings Leonardo in to help out with some fortifications and just kind of help on his military campaigns. And this is, I think, for me, probably the thing that impressed me the most out of all the things that I've seen with Leonardo is he creates this map. And on the surface, you're like, it's a map. What's so special about it? But if you look at this map, so he draws a map of the city of Imola, basically from a militaristic standpoint. Where is all the fortifications? How is the city laid out? And it would essentially be something, if you're a commander in a war and you have, satellite photos or aerial photos of a city, he essentially creates what looks like a satellite photo. And you start to see how he does this. He puts things into grids. He's starting to use geometry to start building out this map. And he creates this incredible map that looks like a bird went over or a satellite went over and just took a picture of it. And I think it's so impressive because can you imagine, being on the battlefield back then? You have no idea. You can send scouts around and you can try to draw rough maps, but to have what looks like a satellite photo of the city that you need to defend or take over, that's a huge advantage for any military commander. And it's just, again, classic Leonardo bringing in his artistic ability to actually draw something like that, but then all of his engineering know-how when it comes to geometry and military engineering and all of the things that you would need to create a map like this. And I think it's just so fascinating. So I would encourage anybody to just go look it up. And again, it just looks like a map, but also remember he made this 500 years ago. And, there's no overhead shots of this. This is all on the ground type of work and using a lot of math and geometry and just his intellect.
It's essentially like one of the earliest, modern looking pieces of cartography that I've ever seen in terms of how like that bird's eye view is laid out, how he's using grids. He's really focused on like the geometric truth here in terms of how he's capturing the city of Imola. I was just looking because I had the map pulled up previously before we jumped on to record, and apparently his title to the Borgia was General Architect and Engineer. So you can see like the value of this, to the Borgia family is that it's giving them very discrete details of the city and how to penetrate it, attack it, if they siege it. So yeah, it's very, very impressive the level of detail he's able to capture from this bird's eye view, which I don't think in terms of how he's getting his resources and information, be able to kind of aggregate all into this view is quite exceptional.
Yeah, again, it's just one of those things you're like, he did what? Why? Oh, okay. Well, on to the next thing, because that's Leonardo. And, okay, fine. He created this map. It's cool. He tried to build a horse and he built the Last Supper. And it's all these cool things. And okay, we're probably done, right? We've probably talked about enough things. Well, what could be bigger than any of those? How about trying to divert a river? That was his next project. So actually, this comes from Niccolo Machiavelli and some of the work that was going on in Florence. So if you know anything about Florentine history, Florence and Pisa always at war with each other. And basically they wanted to divert the Arno River so it wouldn't go through Pisa anymore, and it would just make its way into the Mediterranean. So Florence would essentially cut Pisa off from the Arno River and really make them and give Florence a direct line to the sea, especially because the age of exploration is starting, and there's a little bit of hype around, hey, maybe we want to get involved in this, and also why wouldn't you want access to the sea? So he actually goes and creates this whole plan, does all the calculations on how much earth they need to move, how many people they're going to need to do this, and they actually start work on it. But unfortunately, it's kind of a massive failure, not necessarily due to Leonardo's bad design, and I think there's things he probably did incorrectly, but there's a lot of things around, not fully understanding the type of terrain that they were working with. What kind of soil were they working with? They had some unfortunate weather and some flooding that happened that kind of made things a little bit messy. And so ultimately, you're trying to divert a river. This isn't something that you can do in a weekend. It's a massive project, a very expensive project, and ultimately fails. But again, for someone like Machiavelli and the Florentine government to come to Leonardo and say, hey, I got to divert a river. Do you think you can figure that out? And he goes, yeah, of course I can figure it out. Give me some time and I'll drop some designs for you, and get it to the point where people are like, yeah, this is actually a good idea. We can go do it and actually go and try to execute it. And again, it didn't work, but the fact that they even got to the point where they even tried something like this just goes to show that, Leonardo's at this point now where it's like, there's no limit to the things that he's going to try and ultimately say yes to.
I think it just showcases like a level of brilliance and genius that is really hard to truly understand. Like, you really have to unpack it. And I think the way that I'm kind of looking at it is that, he's definitely this visionary, right? He's a multidisciplinary genius and he has bold ambition, but he's also understanding the importance of hydrodynamics, hydraulic engineering, and integrating it with like political and military strategy, right? Like, he's finding opportunities that make sense to people who are going to pay for these things to, meet whatever, creative itch that he has at this point in time. So in many ways, it's intelligent and well done in many levels, which I think is the really interesting part.
And I think it's interesting that he's working for anybody too, right? He just wants to do cool stuff. He's not, I'm so loyal to Florence and I'll never work with Venice, for example. Like he's working in Milan and then he goes to Venice and helps them build things. And we'll see very shortly that Venice and Milan go to war at some point. So yeah, he's just moving around. He's trying different things, and he's a rock star at this point. Everybody knows who he is. And, what more could they do to kind of, I just like to think about it this way. When we have, two quarterbacks who are great or two athletes who are great, and it's that big match and everybody's really excited, how about you have maybe the two greatest artists of all time in the same city at the same time in their prime? And so we talked about it a little bit on his competition with Michelangelo. So Michelangelo at this point, he's a superstar. He has created the Statue of David, which is basically it's the symbol of Florence at this point. It's so huge, it's so beautiful, and it's taking artistic talent to another level on more of the sculpture side of things, which Michelangelo was really known for doing. And so they said, all right, we got these two guys. We got Da Vinci, we got Michelangelo. We have the Palazzo Vecchio, which is our basically seat of government. And we got two walls. And what if Michelangelo, you paint a painting of one battle on one side, and then Leonardo, you paint a battle on the other side, and we'll see who's better. And this is this competition, right? They've basically said, we're going to pin you two against each other. And I think what they're trying to do is trying to see if they can pull that competitive edge out of the two of them and see if they, they can raise their levels. And it's just cool of an idea. And so Leonardo's painting is this one battle, and we see sketches of this painting, and you can see this just intensity of the battle. And you see things like art historians go through it and they can see, when Leonardo drew this horse, he was thinking, okay, well, what's happening around him? Well, this guy's getting attacked or a cannon's firing. How would that horse react? And he shows one horse like terrified and almost ready to run away. And again, that just goes to show, the level of how Leonardo, he doesn't necessarily just paint things that look cool. He's trying to almost take a picture of what happened at the time and make it hyper realistic. So with that being said, though, I said we have his sketch. We don't actually have the painting. So the painting never happened. He had tried a new method of oil painting on the wall. Pigments began to drip, didn't have great preparation, and ultimately abandoned the project. Michelangelo never completed his fresco either. He actually ended up going to Rome not long after, and Florence ended up getting two new artists to actually paint these scenes. So if you go today, there are two of those battles, and there's rumors that underneath there's actually partial Leonardo work, and the artist put clues on, I think it's like there's flags on the battlefield, and some people claim that the flags represent where Leonardo's work was and what's actually original from Leonardo, but pretty disputed, but fun little story. But this is they create this rivalry, and they kind of go at each other a little bit too throughout this time. But again, another case of Leonardo starting something and not finishing it. And I think at this point too, I don't really think Leonardo has this super competitive side to him. I think he just kind of wants to work on things and roll, and he's not someone who needs to win necessarily. I think, we start to see that and add that into, he's still known for not finishing things. So I think it's kind of a bit of both in this situation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think he is a fierce competitor. I think his greatest motivator is probably just his curiosity and insatiable hunger to learn. But like this whole idea of like two of these artists battling it out in the Renaissance in Florence is pretty awesome. And I think it's almost like this perfect ideal of the Renaissance in some way, right? It kind of symbolizes the need for art to kind of push boundaries of creativity and excellence. And what better way to do it than to get these two masters of art to go against each other? And sadly, they didn't finish it, but it's a pretty interesting, opportunity for these two to kind of push the bounds of Renaissance art through this kind of creative rivalry.
Yeah. And it's funny because at this time too, we talk about, all the great things that Leonardo's been doing, but ultimately the thing that if you ask anybody on the street, what do you know about Leonardo da Vinci? Oh yeah, he painted the Mona Lisa. And so this is when the Mona Lisa is actually started. And so essentially it's a portrait of the wife of a wealthy Florentine merchant. And, it's probably when it was commissioned, Leonardo said, yeah, it's probably some way for me to make money. But Walter Isaacson really puts it well. He says the Mona Lisa wasn't just a portrait. It was a culmination of Leonardo's lifelong quest to capture the mysteries of the human soul and the natural world. And we see this with all of his portraits. It's not just a background or someone inside. They're always out in nature in some way. And you see this with the Mona Lisa and, the smile and just everything about the Mona Lisa that makes it so captivating. And it is really this culmination of all the things that Leonardo's been trying to do. And I think for me, it's always like, yeah, is it that impressive of a painting on its own? Probably not. But when you really look at what Leonardo's been trying to accomplish his whole life on these grander scales, sometimes he's able to kind of work within this small space with one person and really kind of just everything kind of clicks, I think, at this point and create something that there's a reason it's so well known today. Yeah,
I was gonna say I've had the luck of seeing the Mona Lisa, but I didn't really. It was surrounded by a crowd, and I didn't want to wait. But it's very small. It is a very small painting. But I think what makes it stand out, based on what some art historians say, is that it's really that kind of interplay between, I think, Paul, you touched on it, the light and dark, which we know we've talked about in a lot of his artwork in this era of his life. He plays around a lot with, but there's a certain captivating feature with Mona Lisa, or who's painting here, which is this kind of obsession with human anatomy, the softness of her skin, the underlying bone structure, the musculature of how she's sitting, how her hands are resting. There is this very real lifelike element in what he's been able to capture in this portrait. And I think that's what sets it apart. I don't think I was able to appreciate that in the context in which I saw it, but looking at it from my screen, I can definitely see it now.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a story that an Italian was very upset that the French had this painting and tried to steal it once. And I think he actually got it, and then they had to bring it back. So yeah, it's, tight security and all those sort of things. So you're not really going to be able to appreciate it in person, like you would maybe some of his other paintings. But, that's kind of a footnote in the sense that it's still not finished. He brings it with him a lot while he's moving and kind of casually works on it. And I think that goes to show that it's something that he deeply cared about. And I think he's like, okay, I might be onto something here. And this is something I actually want to see through the end. This wasn't just a commission for, a wealthy merchant. And the fact that merchant probably never got the portrait, I think, is just a funny little footnote to all of this.
I think that's such an interest. I didn't know that about the Mona Lisa, right? The fact that he kept it with him, he continued to refine it and work on it. There's not really other examples of something like a deliverable or something that he produced that he continually tried to refine. So there's some kind of like intrigue or mystery here as to why what drew him to this, to continually work on, refining and producing something that I assume he was going to, this ideal of perfection. Whereas other things, once he got tired of it, seems like, yeah, well, I'll revisit that when I have to, but not the Mona Lisa. So that really, I thought was curious and very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maybe part of it too is the fact that it was so small and portable. You could throw it in the back of a wagon and, it's not a wall of a church or something like that. But you're right. There's something to it that was clearly special. I'm sure there was other small things that he was working on that he just abandoned to forget it. But this one meant something to him. And I think that's kind of what I think makes, for whatever reason, with that painting, understanding makes it so famous. So kind of moving on though with Leonardo. Again, I mentioned the map as maybe being my favorite thing that I liked. I think it's close for me. I think his work with the human body might be the most interesting part of him. And I've got a bunch of notes on that. And he's been doing this essentially his whole life. He's been looking at animal bodies, human bodies. He's actually started doing some dissections back in Milan. But really when he gets to Florence, this is when he kind of, has officially, he's in with the hospitals and he's working on these bodies. So when he's in Florence, he gains access to the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova. And basically it's the city's oldest medical institution. And he was essentially given bodies of people who passed away and these cadavers where he was able to, with the permission of medical professionals, work on these anatomical drawings for educational purposes. So basically they would give him a body and say, Leonardo, you have, and this is the thing, remember, there's no refrigeration. This body is going to start rotting really quickly. So Leonardo's against the clock and he has 2, maybe 3 days before he's got to get rid of this thing because it's going to smell so horrid. He needs to be buried. And so he's cutting apart these bodies. He's looking at brains. He's looking at hearts. He's looking at the circulatory system. And he really does a whole bunch of different things. So he looks at the muscular system in a lot of detail, sketches those out, the skeletal system, the nervous system. He looks at the circulatory system. He even looks at the reproductive system of females, especially with like fetuses in the womb. And so this all kind of starts, I think, with Leonardo because he's so obsessed with making the realism in his art. But we start to see this movement where I think he just wants to really know, he wants to understand. And I think it's a not mutually exclusive, but mutually beneficial type process where, sure, if he can learn about something and it makes his art better, why not? But I really kind of want to know how everything works. And so he's bringing all of these things in. And, the one that I think jumps out the most is the fetus in the womb. There's this unbelievable sketch that he's created of a baby kind of, all tucked away with the umbilical cord in a womb. And he's kind of sketching out, writing some notes about it. And again, this is the 1500s. People kind of have an idea, they understand where babies come from, obviously, but to physically see what we would only see years later in x-rays and things like that is, or ultrasounds, is quite impressive. And again, it's just kind of a beautiful sketch. It's just got this level of detail and it's got a little bit of Leonardo flair to it that I think just makes it so cool. And again, I would encourage everyone to take a look at that one, but these drawings are just so detailed and so impressive that you have to take a look at them to really appreciate them.
I'm actually in awe right now. I just pulled it up. It's a piece of art. That is what he's captured there it's incredible. The level of detail, the intricacy. And again, this is very typical of what we've seen up to this point in terms of how he's taking notes and sketching and doing this type of scientific discovery. I think that's kind of the point that I'm leaning towards is that for me, at least, this kind of is like the demarcation where I think his interest starts shifting a little bit more towards that scientific inquiry, trying to understand things. Why are things the way they are? I think he's always had this element of analysis and deep thinking, but I think a shift happens around this point in time where the scientific inquiry and understanding through scientific observation becomes, much more at the epicenter of what he's looking to do.
Yeah, you're right. It's much more of a shift at this point, and I think like he's done what he needs to do from an artistic perspective, and he's curious, and he's helping people too, right? He's working with doctors and actually trying to help them understand things a little bit more. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the circulatory system because of all the things that he looked at. I think this one's the most interesting. So he's really interested in the role of the heart and blood vessels, and he's providing these drawings that basically are precursors to modern cardiology. It's just so detailed and correct, quite frankly. So he's looking at heart chambers, valves, the flow of blood, noting that the heart is a pump. And so we know that today, obviously, the heart pumps blood through our bodies, which was kind of a revolutionary idea at the time. There had been some Greek philosophers who had actually theorized that the heart actually maintained the temperature of the blood, so it would be able to flow around it. It wasn't actually a pump. It was just creating heat. And so to be able to look at it and say, oh yeah, that's a pump, and I can see why, and I can understand the valves. And he correctly observed the presence of heart valves and theorized their role of directing the blood flow. And he also noted that the aortic valve opened and closed in response to the motion of blood, creating vortices that assisted in sealing the valve when it was time to do so. And these are, again, it's not the final scientific discovery, but it's pushed things so far along that William Harvey in the 17th century actually fully puts together a scientific model around the whole blood circulatory system. But again, if you look back at what Leonardo is looking at, he doesn't have a name for a lot of these things. He's saying, hey, this is what I saw, and this might be true, and this might be true. And a lot of the stuff is actually right. And again, it's just observation. It's pure science in its purest form here of observation and making assumptions around this. He doesn't have the mathematics or the traditional, observation and testing and those sort of things that science would have in the next 200-300 years. But at its rawest form, he's observing things and he's not falling back on superstition. And that's the biggest thing, right? Back then, superstition is so key to everything. He's seeing something and he's like, this is what it is. And, that's the end of it. There's no, how does some sort of magical thing kind of cut into this? It's, if I'm not seeing it, I'm not going to count it. And that's, I think, what makes his work so fascinating here.
Yeah, these sketches legitimately look like anatomical drawings of a heart. Like, they are incredibly detailed. And it's interesting that he's able to theorize so well. And again, like you can see him being a polymath here, right? His understanding of hydraulics, how those things work. And he's able to kind of, contextualize with what he knows today and theorize that maybe the heart is like a hydraulic system pumping and moving blood in and out of the body. It's insane. It's so incredible that someone could put all of this together with such a limited technological innovation just through pure scientific observation and theorizing and pulling from the other disciplines that he's, so well versed in.
Absolutely. And I think like he's talking about, vortices, and that's, talking about laminar and turbulent flow, which is like the basics of fluid mechanics. And this is the 1500s and he's doing these kind of things. I think it's so interesting. And my final point on the circulatory system is there's this really fascinating story. So in Leonardo's notebooks, he writes, one day he's at the hospital and he says, this old man, he's a few hours before his death, told me that he had passed his 100th year and he felt nothing wrong with his body other than weakness. And thus, while sitting on the bed in the hospital in Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, he passed from his life without any movement or showing no sign of accident. So Leonardo, instead of going, poor guy, he's 100 years old, he just died of old age. Well, what do you mean he died of old age? What does that even mean? Doesn't feel any pain. He just feels tired and then eventually passes on. And so what he does is he dissects the body and he realizes that the coronary vessels are really tight. There's a really narrow vessels. And essentially what he's discovered is arteriosclerosis, which is the hardening of these arteries, which actually didn't officially become a diagnosis until the 19th century. And so again, I love it because he's like, oh, this guy died. He didn't just die of old age. No, he died of something physical. There's something physical that happened here. And again, it's that pure scientific inquiry of, it's not just, it was his time. It doesn't make him feel good to just say, hey, he lived 100 years. Good for him. No, there's something that actually physically happened. And I'm curious to find out what that is. And ultimately he does so. And so I think too, with him just kind of wrapping up on the human body here, and we're going to go a little bit long this week because it's Leonardo, he gets extra time. I think that's more than fair. He's doing things. He's not just looking at human bodies. He's looking at animals. And what he's trying to do is he's like, well, what's similar if I open an animal like a bird and I look at a human, what's the same and what's different? And he's trying to find these universal constants amongst all of these different species. And so, okay, everybody has a heart. If you look at a cow, it's got multiple stomachs. Okay, well, why is that? And he's trying to think about these sort of different things. And, it's just very fascinating how it all comes together. But I think the last piece that, Richie, we need to talk about when it comes to the human body stuff is the Vitruvian Man. So we really haven't touched on this. He drew this back when he was in Milan, but I think it kind of makes sense in the context of what we're talking about. And it's this, perfect proportions of what a human should look like. And it's got its artistic elements to it that just make it really pop and make it so famous. And, never mind the geometry and the symmetry of it. It's got a little bit of that Leonardo flair to it, which again was kind of par for the course at this point.
Yeah, I think it's almost an unassuming sketch in many ways, right? Like first glance, okay, yeah, it's a sketch of an anatomical man, but it's more than that. It's probably one of the most iconic images of the Renaissance. I would argue, and the drawing is based on writings of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, so it illustrates the ideal human proportions. And obviously, if you've seen the image, which I assume most people have, places a man within a circle and a square and represents the cosmic and earthly realms. But for Leonardo, this wasn't just an exercise in artistic skill, as we know, but it becomes this kind of profound exploration of the interconnectedness of the human body, mathematics, and the universe as a whole. And it kind of, I think the Vitruvian Man, like as a symbol, it kind of encapsulates that Renaissance belief that, within humanism and humanity, is central to understanding the natural world. And it's a perfect blend of art and science.
Yeah, I think I got a great quote from Walter Isaacson that I think kind of sums up what you just said really well and this kind of whole period. And Walter Isaacson, he says, Leonardo's studies of the human body were not merely artistic or scientific. They were a celebration of the unity of creation. He approached anatomy with the reverence of an artist, the curiosity of a scientist, and the imagination of a visionary. And so I think what you were just describing there of it's everything, right? And it's got a bigger meaning than just, hey, this looks cool, or from a geometric standpoint, it works out. It's telling a little bit something more. And I think, going back to the Roman philosopher and kind of making it all kind of come together gives a little bit of an extra kind of piece to it. So yeah, I think it's a good way to kind of sum up this whole kind of exploration into, the human body from pretty much every avenue that we've talked about with Leonardo.
And I think it really underpins those Renaissance ideals, right? Like I know we haven't spent that much time talking about the Renaissance because there's so much to talk about just about Leonardo, but this is the Renaissance period in which he's kind of flourishing. He's at the epicenter of it. And, again, it does kind of encapsulate all of these ideals kind of coming together. And, in my mind, there is many examples of, Renaissance men, but I would consider Leonardo the Renaissance man above all else.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about it. I think when you think Renaissance man, you have him, maybe Lorenzo de' Medici, you have the two separate, very separate, but kind of encapsulating this period in time. So like we mentioned, though, with Leonardo, he's got to go back to Milan. He always seems to find his way back. So he ends up going back to Milan for about 5 years, definitely continuing on the type of work that he does. Nothing too crazy happens, I think, at this point, but kind of in my notes, it said, he had a house at this time. He seemed very like he was having a good time. But unfortunately had to leave due to another invasion. So he only lasted there for another 5 years. And this time he actually ends up going to Rome under the patronage of Pope Leo X. And so Rome is bustling with artists right now. Michelangelo is there, and he's really, I don't remember exactly what he's done at the time, but the Sistine Chapel has either happened or it's about to happen. And he's done part of it. Either he's done the ceiling, but he hasn't done behind the altar or vice versa. He's in his prime. Raphael is in his prime as well, creating these beautiful works. And now this is an opportunity for Leonardo, but also a challenge. His contemporaries are more focused on this monumental artistic work where it's, big religious spectacles, which is great. This is the Vatican right there. That's the kind of stuff that they want. But Leonardo is continuing to push this scientific type of studies with anatomy, botany, hydraulics. He even spends a lot of time with botany at this time, which I think is fun just because, why not, right? But unfortunately, this period of time, it's marked by a lot of frustration. He really can't get the type of work that he wants. He's facing a lot of competition from younger artists. And like we mentioned, I don't think Leonardo is like, oh, all these guys think they're better than me, I'll show them. Kind of wants to, it's not his style, right? He wants to be in an area where he's a little bit more comfortable to do the things that he wants to do. But he continues his groundbreaking work. His notebooks are filled with incredible work from this time. And the anatomical drawings are continuing to grow. And again, it's Leonardo just kind of hitting his stride. He's kind of getting later in his life. He's done a lot of these bigger works. I think now it's just, I got to fulfill my curiosity in whatever way I can. And he's trying to do that the best he can in Rome. But again, it's not really the right environment for him.
I think you nailed it. I think it's definitely not the right environment for him. And I think there's some contention here, right? This is Rome. He's been invited back by the papacy. The papacy is commissioning all these great works, and Leonardo's kind of done them already. He's not so interested in that anymore.
Yeah. And he's definitely not going to be painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel or anything like that. Like, it's just not his style to really work on something so detailed for so long. And that's the kind of commissions, that Michelangelo's getting and a lot of these other people are getting. And so, yeah, it's a tough period for him. But the good thing, I think, with Rome is there's a lot happening and there's a lot of people to talk to and a lot of people to discuss with and learn things from. But I think you kind of hinted at it a little bit, this is the religious of religious cities. And, he's going to definitely ruffle some feathers, I think, with, some of the work that he's doing, pushing into more of the traditional science approach.
He definitely does. And I have one anecdote that I think is probably kind of sums this up or kind of typifies it pretty well. So at this point, Leonardo becomes increasingly interested in optical illusions and reflections. He's probably inspired by some of his studies into optics, into the eye and theatrical devices, used to create these very striking visual effects. So he essentially very carefully arranges a set of mirrors. And he's able to manipulate reflections, magnify objects, and create illusions of infinite space. So that it's that whole mirror to a mirror thing, right? And these experiments amazed visitors. They kind of marveled at this lifelike and almost magical quality of the reflections. But, the system not only demonstrated his understanding of light and geometry, but also revealed in my mind, like his flair for captivating an audience, that pageantry, those theatrics, that such devices could stimulate perspectives or create illusions that could kind of, capture a person being in multiple places at one time. However, and I think this goes back to the, whole idea of contention, is that the sophistication, mysteriousness of these optical effects, they stirred some suspicion amongst some members of the papal court. I'm sure we all saw that coming in a time when, scientific understanding is kind of limited. And I think you mentioned earlier, Paul, that superstition remains pretty prevalent in a theological way of thinking. So much so that, he's kind of accused of having magical behavior, or that he might be a sorcerer. These were not uncommon catch-alls for polymaths of the Renaissance who, typically had this type of groundbreaking work. And I think it actually led to a lot of papal frustration. There's a quote here from Pope Leo X, who is famously said to have remarked, "This man will never do anything, for he begins by thinking of the end before the beginning." Yeah,
I'm not even sure how to respond to that quote, because it's kind of where Leonardo is. I want to understand this, so I'm going to work backwards, where, they're thinking more in the sense of, okay, you need to make a painting, so you're going to start with this, and you're going to move to this. It's a little bit more step one, step two, almost paint by numbers in a sense. So yeah, I can see why it doesn't really work out. And, being brought there by Pope Leo, and then Leo's making those types of comments, I think tells us enough that this isn't the right environment for Leonardo at this point. So the last few years of his life, though, I think he finally finds his home, really, a place where somebody finally understands him. And so in 1516, the King of France actually invites Leonardo to a chateau near the city of Amboise, and he gives him the title of first painter, first engineer, and architect to the king. So he's given this crazy title. He's given this generous amount of money to just come. And so he shows up and he goes to the king, what do you want me to build? What do you want me to make? And the king goes, nothing. Do what you want. I'm just inviting you here because he's not maybe saying this directly, but he goes, I want to be seen as someone who's culturally with it. I want the best people in the world to be in my court because it gives me prestige. And the king basically says, yeah, do whatever you want. You want to go for a walk and look at nature? Great. If you want to paint something, go for it. If you want to help me with military stuff, absolutely come and do it. But ultimately, he just wants Leonardo's presence. And I think the King of France is probably the first person who really understands Leonardo in that sense. Obviously he has his reasons for doing things. He's obviously probably a lot more wealthy than, the Duke of Milan, and he's the king of an entire country, right? Maybe not quite as rich as the Pope, but he's got a lot of things that he can have him do. And so this is it. He's able to just kind of roam around and do what he wants. And, he brought the Mona Lisa with him, which eventually finishes in France. He continues to study hydraulics, flight, mechanics, all of these sort of things. And the King of France, he actually really likes Leonardo as a person. Apparently he would come visit him often and be like, hey, what are you working on? Oh, that's really interesting. Let's have a discussion about art and science and philosophy. And I think, Leonardo's found, a friend more than just a person who's, paying his salary. And I think for Leonardo, it's kind of poetic in a sense that, it took this long, but finally somebody gets who he is, and someone who kind of appreciates him as a person more than an employee, for lack of a better term.
I think the title summarizes it quite perfectly, right? We can't give him, 3 different titles. So let's just bridge it all together, because this is what, Leonardo's going to bring to the table. And I think, I agree with you. It seems like he ends up in a pretty happy place. He's got a pension. He's got a place. He has total, intellectual freedom to just go where his mind desires without the pressures of completing large commissions. I don't think he has any interest in doing this anymore at this point in his life. He just wants to learn scientific inquiry and, just learn interesting stuff and let curiosity kind of take him where it will.
Absolutely. And again, this is the old man Leonardo that we think of, long beard. He's kind of slower moving. He's kind of at the end of his life here. And this is perfect for him. He's got a few years left in his life, and I think he probably knows it. And he's able to kind of do what he wants and do a little bit more interesting things. And, he finishes the Mona Lisa, which, as we said, is his most famous work. But unfortunately, like I said, his life is coming to an end. And so on May 2nd, 1519, he dies. And one of his earliest biographers says he dies in the arms of the king, which, obviously not necessarily true, but romanticized, but I kind of think is a bit of a fitting conclusion to kind of the relationship that they had and kind of the end of his life. And so there's some interesting things though about his death. He didn't just pass away and then we move on. He actually wrote his will just shortly before he died, and it reflects his deep relationships, some of his practical concerns, and even his artistic legacy. So he left most of his belongings, including his manuscripts, notebooks, and tools, to his close assistant and companion, Francesco Melzi, who was with him for many years, and he kind of regarded as his intellectual heir. And I think Francesco actually publishes some of Leonardo's works later on in his life. But I think most interesting is he gives Salai some land, some money. And I think it just kind of goes to show that, for his entire life, Salai's kind of been by his side, been his more than a friend, his lover in some sense. And, I think that relationship stayed strong to the end of his life, and, to be able to, pass some of the things on to him. I think this is kind of a nice conclusion because, like I said, we always think of Leonardo as a very stoic and kind of introverted type person. But like we said, he had a lot of relationships with different people in different ways. And to know that some of them stayed strong from, the moment they started to the moment of his death, I think is a nice conclusion, especially for someone who never married or ever had kids.
Yeah, I think with someone like Leonardo, we lose the person and the genius, right? And I think in terms of how we kind of approach this episode, I think we've got a really good sense of who he was as a person, that the things that drove him, the things that motivated him up until the point that he becomes the Leonardo that we all often think about as this stoic genius that is just, knee deep in notebooks and sketches.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this so interesting. And it's, I think, to Leonardo's own fault that we don't know much about him because he didn't tell us anything. He wrote all this stuff. He could have told us, what do you like for breakfast, or how do you take your coffee? But none of that stuff we really get to see, but we do know that the people around him always spoke highly of him. And, I think this episode, the hardest part was to not just gush over him the whole time, because we definitely did a lot of that. And I think it's almost impossible not to do, just based on all of the things that he was able to accomplish in his life. And he's famous for a reason. He is who he is for a reason. And I think he's, the Renaissance is the perfect time for someone like him. And the Renaissance doesn't exist without Leonardo, but Leonardo doesn't exist without the Renaissance, I think, is kind of the way I look at it. And, it is the perfect capsulation of history when the perfect person is born at the perfect time, and it just clicks, because 200 years earlier he's not accomplishing a lot of this stuff. 200 years later he probably has to go through maybe a more traditional scientific approach, and who knows how that works out. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but this is the time where things are kicking into high gear, people rewarding him for his intellectual curiosity, and he's becomes Leonardo da Vinci.
I think there's so many things that you can take away from these two episodes about his life. And for me personally, I think it's the visionary thinking, the curiosity and obsession with learning and adaptability. He was willing to move around to where opportunities came to him, but it was always motivated by a sense of self and what he was trying to accomplish. And I think, credit to him for doing that. And I think regardless of all of his output and productivity, he could have lived 10 lifetimes over and never finished what he wanted to.
Absolutely. There's no end to the curiosity that he had. And I think the one piece that I like is just kind of, as we're wrapping up, is the humility. I don't think we really touched on it, is, that competition with Michelangelo. If Leonardo was this very vain guy who was all about being the best, he would have finished that and he would have said, haha, Michelangelo, you couldn't do it. I did it and I win. You don't really see any of that. And even when he dies, he basically says, look, just give me a small funeral, very modest, bury me in the chapel. I don't need some big, mausoleum to me. Just, bury me, do a little small ceremony and, get on with your life. And you see that additional piece of he speaks through his work clearly, but he's not doing his work for the sense of any sort of personal pride in that sense. He's doing it because he loves it and he's interested, and he doesn't need, as much as how great as that title was, it's not something he necessarily needed other than the license to, go do what he wanted to do. Yeah. So I think that's probably a great way to wrap up. My goodness, Leonardo da Vinci, we're 2 and a bit hours into talking about him over 2 episodes. And, I think we could have gone longer if we really wanted to, but, he's the perfect way, I think, to kind of sum up this, all the different episodes we've done on the Renaissance. And we'll absolutely be back with talking about more people in the Renaissance. We'll see who it's going to be next, but, I think it's a great period, and this has been a lot of fun. So thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah. Hard to follow up the man of the Renaissance with anyone else, but we'll try our best. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.